March 9th, 1989. Nashville, Tennessee. A man lay dead on 16th Avenue. 3 bullets lodged in him, 2 of them in the back of his head. Why did this happen? Who was behind this gruesome murder? And why did it involve a music chart? Let's dive into the bonkers story of the murder on Music Row. Kevin Hughes was, by all accounts, a stand-up guy. Grew up in rural Illinois, went to school at Belmont University in Nashville, and obsessed over music charts. In 1985, he got himself an internship at one of the biggest powerhouses in music, the definitive name in music charts, the one, the only, Cashbox. This might surprise you, but once upon a time, Billboard was not the only major music chart publication. There were 2 other major competitors in the mid to late 1900s, Record World and Cashbox.
If Billboard's the ocean, I think Cashbox is a stream.
That's Keith Sharon, a journalist at the Tennessean and the mind behind the stellar Murder on Music Row podcast.
It was all about jukeboxes that were in restaurants, and people put in a dime or a quarter, a nickel, or however much it was back in the day, and it would record who had the most plays. In the 1950s, I believe, maybe 1948, something like that, they started to rank songs. Back in the day, it would have Prince on the cover or Madonna on the cover, and it became more subjective.
Cashbox gained prominence specifically in Nashville, a hyperlocal outlet that could make or break up-and-coming talent. And there was no chart that held more sway in town than the independent country singles chart.
You wouldn't think of it now, but that top 50 independent list, if you got your name on that list, you thought that you were on your way.
That was the chart folks like Sammy Sadler were gunning to get on. Sammy was a young songwriter and a good friend of Kevin's. By 1988, Kevin had been bumped up to director of the country music charts. This was a dream job for Kevin, but the more he settled into his role, the more he learned about how Cashbox actually worked. At this point in time, music charts were not determined by algorithmic data, nor was there some separate third-party entity like Luminate or SoundScan that would compile data. Back then, the process was rudimentary.
What it was supposed to be was that the chart director would call radio stations and find out, literally with a pencil and a piece of graph paper, how many plays Garth Brooks had this week versus Randy Travis versus Reba McEntire. And they would write down, and then they call another radio station, and they would add them all up and make a list.
Due to a lack of tech at the time, this was the best these folks could do. But it was a simplistic and vague process, one that could be manipulated if someone were so inclined. And now's probably the best time to tell you about a man named Chuck Dixon. Chuck Dixon was a record promoter in Nashville. He was also the most mafia man to ever exist.
Pinky ring, chest hair, riding around in a black sedan with a driver, make you an offer you can't refuse. And that's what he thought he had. And that's the way he kind of ran his little sliver of the town. And I think he was a big fish in his little aquarium. He was a guy who didn't make it in music, but he saw that he could make it another way, kind of behind the scenes, and he got into Cashbox magazine. And when he controlled Cashbox magazine, he controlled who was cool and who was not.
I cannot stress enough how much of a caricature Chuck Dixon was. According to some folks, he used to watch the Godfather trilogy 4 to 5 times a week.
Well, Chuck Dixon weaseled his way in at first as a promoter and producer, and then as a guy kind of shadow figure who ran the magazine, at least that independent chart. He started charging money for slots on the chart. So if you wanted to be number one, I interviewed a guy who said he met with Chuck, and Chuck said, well, that'll be $50,000. It doesn't matter if your song ever played on the radio. It doesn't matter. Sometimes it didn't matter if your song was finished. Sometimes it didn't matter if your song had a title. You paid and Chuck put you there.
The process Keith just laid out is commonly known as payola. money in exchange for music promotion.
Payola was made illegal through the Communications Act of 1960. And as we all know, when something is made illegal, no one ever does it again.
For real though, cases of payola still happened after it was criminalized, at places like Cashbox. It wasn't solely Chuck who was manipulating Cashbox like this. There was also his right-hand man, Tony D'Antonio.
The bad dude who needed a lot of money, who was, divorcing his wife and trying to make it in Nashville, another singer-songwriter who couldn't make it. And he found his niche as the chart director. And he's the one who hired Kevin Hughes to take over because he got in trouble for hitting on all the women in the office and some inappropriate activity, bringing drugs into the office and such. And so when Tony D'Antonio got fired, there was an opening and Kevin Hughes filled that.
Now remember what I said earlier about Kevin Hughes, nice, upstanding guy. When he began learning about how Cashbox was actually run, it did not sit well with him at all. He severed ties with 4 radio stations who were doing these backroom deals, and he was even getting into fights with Cashbox's owner, refusing to put artists who paid on the charts.
I think he just had this moral code that, hey, you're supposed to call the radio stations and find out what the numbers are, and so I'm going to do that. And if it says Joe Smith had 10 plays and Sally Struthers had 9 plays, then Joe is ahead of Sally. And so he's the number 1 and she's the number 2. That's the way it should work. And the rumor was that Kevin was about to go to the Tennessean, the newspaper where I work, and he was going to expose the whole scam.
Which brings us back to March 9th, 1989. In the evening, Kevin was working late, as he usually did. Sammy Sadler came by, and the two decided to get food at a local diner. Following dinner, they stopped at the label Sammy worked at called Evergreen Records so he could call his parents. While on the phone, the guys heard someone try to enter and then saw them walk away. After the call, they went back to Kevin's car. But just as he was about to start the car, a man walked up and shot both Kevin and Sammy. Kevin tried to run down the road, but was shot 2 more times. When the police arrived, Sammy had survived, albeit with a major artery damaged, and Kevin was dead.
The authorities had many questions about what happened, but the biggest one was, why Kevin? He was a young guy, an upstanding citizen, and a music chart director. Why would he, of all people, be killed in such a coordinated manner?
The case lingered for a good while. Multiple different theories came to be, then fizzled out before they could be something more. Sammy was considered a suspect for a while, given how he was there and lived. But then, 2 wild coincidences helped put this case to bed.
Okay, so the first was there was an unrelated Nashville investigator who was dealing with a fraud case in the music business. And so she went undercover as a country singer. Granted, she couldn't sing, but she was willing to pay her way to the top. This operation led to a music promoter getting caught and arrested, but he was willing to squeal in exchange for his freedom. He gave some dirt to the cops about a murder involving one Chuck Dixon.
The second was a show called Unsolved Mysteries.
It appears on Unsolved Mysteries, and a drug dealer in North Georgia sees it, and he's in trouble himself because he's part of a ring that is running drugs for a cartel in Mexico up through the southern United States, and he's been caught. And so he wants to play ball with the officials who have him dead to rights. And he says, I know about a murder. So he sees the show on television. He realizes, wait a minute, I think I sold a gun to the guy who committed that crime.
The gun was sold to none other than Tony D'Antonio. Based on that intel, the cops went to the drug dealer's house in Georgia and started digging. And what did they find?
They find a bullet that matches the one that was in Kevin Hughes' head. And without that bullet, it would have never been solved.
In 2003, Tony D'Antonio was found guilty for the murder of Kevin Hughes. He was sentenced to life in prison, where he stayed until his death in 2014. If you're wondering why Chuck wasn't arrested, it's because he passed away in 2001 before the feds could pin him for his role in the murder.
And even then, his death has a lot of weird, unresolved questions about it. That's how mafia works, I guess.
Now, thankfully, this was the only time someone was killed over Cashbox music charts. In fact, Cashbox would close its doors in 1996, though it was brought back in 2006. They got Con Hunley in this shit.
But don't take that to mean the issue behind Kevin's murder is gone. At the core of this story is a tale as old as time. Young, doe-eyed singers come to Nashville with dreams of making it big, only to be exploited by greedy promoters.
In order to make it in Nashville, you had to be able to dodge the sharks. There was this level of promoter, producer types who were only out to take your money and make you believe that if you just gave $10,000 more, they would work harder for you and you would get onto the charts and they would get you a record deal. And I'm sorry, did I say 10,000? No, I meant 15. No, I meant 20. And it just getting deeper and deeper and deeper involved. You're a great singer. If you would just give me a little more money, you're this close to making it. And people fell for it all the time.
Nowadays, the process for determining charts is a lot more regimented, with Luminate calculating streams and plays and purchases. But that doesn't mean the concept of paying for promotion in music is completely gone.
If anything, it's just become a lot more nebulous. Spotify's discovery mode riled up folks by asking for money in exchange for better visibility in the algorithm. And social media platforms like Instagram and TikTok encourage creators to boost posts with real money. I'm not saying any of those are outright payola, but it's certainly possible to tilt the scales in your favor if you've got the money to spend.
Because whether it's TikTok or Spotify or SoundScan or local record shops, there is something about the music business that inspires a ruthless drive in some people, to the point where a man would be shot and killed over it.
I think it was deadly serious for the people who wanted and dreamed and tried and spent to get a foothold in Nashville. The Cashbox independent chart became life and death important to them, and Chuck Dixon and therefore Kevin Hughes were the hurdles that you needed to overcome in order to get there. Somebody needed to die over it in order to get out of the way so that it could go on. The graft and the corruption and the underhanded payments and all of that stuff. As long as there are people who want to dream big, I think there will be victims in this case.
I hope this story makes you realize that murder is bad. If you're thinking of murdering someone, you shouldn't do it. You should instead write diss tracks about them. That's what Paul McCartney did to John Lennon after the Beatles broke up, and John was totally unharmed. That's why they call him John Famously Not Murdered Lennon. The Fab Four's individual stories after they split are full of wild details. I learned all about them by watching McCartney After the Beatles, available exclusively on Nebula. Have you ever wanted to watch all my videos without ads or sponsors? Have you ever wanted a ton of exclusive shows and series from the best online creators today? Have you ever wanted a dog that speaks Gaelic? Nebula gives you two of those things. It's a prestige, creator-owned streaming service, and the level of quality on it is insane. Their originals are on the same level as any other streaming service out there. If you sign up with the link in the description, go.nebula.tv/MikeTheSnare, or scan the QR code on screen, not only will you help support me and the channel, but you'll also get 50% off an annual membership. Thanks to Nebula for sponsoring this video. Bye-bye.